We're gonna go. We are live now.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh yeah.
Um, okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Luna, for being here. I'm so happy to
Yeah.
speak to you. Like I've been following your work for a long time. I find it super amusing what you do with your work with plants, like the way you go about creating. So I'm very excited to have you on and to have this conversation. How are you doing?
Good. I was just telling you before I was up so late, and so I'm just like chugging coffee and water like crazy right now.
I
Looking,
woke you up.
yeah.
Well, I'd love to start maybe like, just knowing a little bit more about you, like who is Luna and how did your like kind of journey into NFTs and like crypto started? You've been around for a while now. It's like, you're almost one of the early ones. So yeah, how did that all come about?
Yeah, I know. I didn't even know how long I was doing this until I got that email that, with the new
Super
token thing,
rare.
you've been on super rare for X amount of days. And I was like, oh my God, like really? It doesn't really feel that long, but it also does, I guess. I yeah, so my name is Luna, and I'm here in Los Angeles. Um, with the email they told me I was on super rare for like about 340 days or something, like almost a year at this point. Um, and I my background is more in the sculptural realms, like sculpture, installation, like physical objects. Was I studied more like industrial design back at school, and so a lot of my work has been hands-on up until like pretty fairly recently. Um, and even with the current work I'm doing now with the transparent gardens and these aquatic installations, they're still physical works, but just captured on film and created into these digital video artwork pieces. And so, but honestly, the transition from like the physical to working with digital media is still kind of within like a new space for me. And the NFT scene and like the super rare, like they also kind of they approached me at a time where I like really first started to kind of understand this process that I'm working with, and creating some like the first pieces that I had ever done successfully with this process that I was developing for about like a year and a half of extracting all like the chlorophyll and the color and like essentially the cells from these plants and creating these skeletal scaffolds that are then installed in these aquatic tanks. Um, and actually, the first person that approached me was Alessio. And so, shout out to him. Before he was even doing like the the head
Curation.
curator and things like that. So he just like, yeah, I just like I got like a DM. He was like, hey, I don't know you, but would you be interested in doing something like this? And um yeah, it really just started from that. And then I just like got talked to Zach and had like the inaugural phone call back then, like where there wasn't the application forms that like complicated things like that, which um and it just really transitioned seamlessly into what I'm doing now as like digital artworks that are sold now as NFTs. But yeah, so thank you to Alessio
I've
for
discovered so
doing
many
the
artists
DMs.
through Alessio.
I know. I mean, like when you became the head curator of the super rare space, like I don't think anybody was really surprised. It
Yeah.
makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah, he's amazing. And also like the stuff that he shares on Instagram, like I'm constantly, like discovering like so many. I think actually I probably
Yeah.
discovered you through him because he was resharing. I think he reshared like a lot of your work on Instagram. And I was
Yeah.
like,
Thank you
you
so
know,
much.
at first I was like, Are these real plants? Like, are you actually, like using because sometimes, you think it might be like digitally kind of like made and it's not. And when I discovered that you're actually it's physical work that you do, and then I kind of process it digitally. I was amazed. Yeah, I want to know more about that. Like, how does this process start, middle, end? Like, how is it? Like, how do you go about doing this amazing artwork?
Well, it first starts by just going outside. And, for a lot of the works I was doing in the beginning and for tests, I would just, Los Angeles has so much nature and so many plants, especially when I first started, it was during springtime. So there's all these, like wildflowers growing. So I would just be collecting and more or less kind of foraging these plant types and then testing it out to see whether it would work or not. So essentially, what is happening is that I spent like a year or so researching and developing this method of directly removing all the chlorophyll or like the living cells from these plants, and it's an incubation method. So it takes roughly about like 3 to 4 weeks or so for it to get from the original plant to this scaffold to the point where it becomes this translucent and more or less like transparent plant. And once it gets to that final stage, like, they're technically no longer really alive, and they're also technically no longer really plants because like all of those plant cells have been removed. So all you're left with is just this tissue that's still left in the original anatomy of the plant that I was working with originally. And so it's just, it's a process that definitely took a lot of research and development, and so many tests. And like, there's really wasn't too much of a precedent for me to go off of in terms of how to do the entire body of the plant. Um, and a lot of this research, really does pull from like the medical journals or from like more scientific research like botany and like understanding the cellular structures of plants and organic materials. And so it does stem from like that place, but transforming it into more of a physical like, installation that, kind of transcends like what our understanding are of plants and how we view nature outside of the natural environment. Um, and so these plants are then like curated in these aquatic tanks where they're installed and planted in kind of like a micro universe. And so each one has its contained walls, in the tanks, but the current of like the water, the filtration system, everything plays a part in creating this world.
Yeah.
Um, so a lot of people, yeah, they would think that it's CG or things like that because like there's movement and it's not just a still. Um, but it's all analog and using the current to create like the natural movement that like subtly mimics wind, but it's also very unworldly in terms of how these plants are moving. And capturing all that on film has been my way of working with this material or this type of work because essentially the plants like do decay over time. Like it's organic matter, so after 6 months or so they essentially disintegrate. And so the video art is a way of preserving these tanks, mm-hmm, as a permanent installation in video and digital media.
It's incredible. Like, I'm curious, really, like, actually, like, how did the idea of doing this, like, come about? Like, is it something that, you've kind of like always done, like working with like actually like plants and doing this? Like, this is so like unique. How did you start? Like, where, tell us that story. Like, I'm just really curious.
I mean, well, I've always been really interested in material sciences more than so much like science or chemistry or anything more within like the in that realm. Like I'm by no means, a trained chemist or anything like that. A lot of this is just a lot of trials and just figuring out what's possible for me to do using the limitations or working within the limitations that I have. And I guess it all really just, it's hard to pinpoint exactly like what what the origin of anything is, but you know, I I'm really fascinated by not so much like of course nature, but also how we have created these artificial environments of nature for us to enjoy as like a capsule moment. And so, for example, like botanical gardens or even just small ecosystems like terrariums or aquascaping, especially in aquascaping, is like creating these micro worlds and containing it for us to enjoy. And so it's this appreciating nature, but kind of in an artificial way. And so, but that still brings us a lot of joy in ways that we, if we can't necessarily reach the outdoors in that context, we can have like a little garden in our home, and that brings us some type of peace or some joy or some solace. And I think that is what really propelled me into wanting to work with plants as a medium, but also straying away from how plants are typically used in art or in design, and introducing sciences and different types of research to physically alter the plant itself rather than just like taking the natural beauty of it, which we of course can enjoy, but how I really wanted to question just like how can we push our understanding of nature and what we see like, taken for granted. And so a lot of my works here, like they don't necessarily always choose like the prettiest vibrant flower or you know um, traditional compositions in terms of how certain plants are arranged together, because once it becomes this monochromatic palette, it just becomes a field of texture. So I really like looking at plants that we just overlook, like nettles or chickweeds or like small plants that we just step on every single day while we appreciate like a beautiful
Mhm.
sunflower or something like that. But there's a lot of like so many different plants out there with these alien type like, morphologies that we just don't necessarily appreciate unless we look at it in a new context. And so a lot of this work was also just like my it kind of paralleled my lifestyle of like slowing down, like looking at the world, especially because like all last year we were so cooped up in our homes. All we could really do was enjoy the outside and appreciate the little things that are still like lively when everything was so dead. Um and yeah, and so that's I guess like kind of where it comes from in a
That's amazing. Like I'm honestly just like listening with pleasure. I find it really interesting what you mentioned around, like trying to like understand and like taking out what is usually considered as like beautiful and
right.
like, just like admiring it from a perspective where, you're taking out the color, you're taking out the livelihood, and all that's left is like the pure like essence of the plant. And you're
Yeah,
transferring that into,
exactly.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
it's the pure essence, and then also, it's just like there's so many discoveries that can be found this way too, and just a lot of plants. Again, I'm looking at this really just from texture, from like a more of a sculptural lens, and so when I when I'm just like outside looking for things, like it just everything just becomes like what shape does it have? Like how can we transform these landscapes that we traditionally see also in like botanical gardens or in floral arrangements or things like that, how we use nature to create this artificial experience of nature while still using the living plant themselves, and then but then kind of breaking all those rules and boundaries of what combinations are appropriate or what patterns like what color combinations have to be used. Like this really strips away all those limitations and boundaries and then just creates a form world where I also just get to play by combining aquatic plants and terrestrial plants, by flipping normal flowers that are supposed to hang up like downwards from branches and flipping it upside down, using plants that are supposed to be these tall blooming blossoms, but then like cutting it at the stem and then just using it as a foreground. Like I'm really able to just play with like nature as a medium without having the typical constraints that you have as a gardener or as a floral arrangement or and things like that.
I mean, there is like so many different parts of this that are super like interesting to me. Like one of them is for sure like the way that you actually work pretty much is like it's physical, like really physical. And so I'm interested to like
Mhm.
understand, how like that transition like happened for you, like into like the digital. Like, do you think it's something that, you mentioned that you kind of started exploring the digital medium with, NFTs and are like kind of like worked around this medium now for a while. Like, is it something that you feel um what has it added to your practice and how, you feel like it's complementing that kind of physicality that you've maybe done with like installations and in the past?
Well, like the before I even started NFTs, like initially I was creating these films with these tanks, and so I would have like a beta fish come in and like swim through the landscape, and then I was creating more of a, I don't want to say narrative, but just like a film with an actor being like my beta fish and creating these landscapes for them to swim around and play with and capturing that on film. And the digital aspect of this work was always part of how I imagined it to be completed, like with or without the NFTs, because these tanks are all ephemeral pieces, and so I'll have them, but they do disintegrate over some time, and so and also with the element of the water and the current and the subtle movements that these plants have, like there's no way I could capture like the actual essence of how ghostly these do become when they're submerged in the installation tanks with like the really subtle like gentle sways that they have. It can't be captured via photography. It like had to be captured via film, and so the whole work is kind of packaged together like in a digital media way. But I'm not necessarily fixed to this always staying in the digital realm too. So like I recently just had this installation and exhibition in my studio where I had these aquarium tanks physically installed in my own studio space, and also had the video of the work that was also displayed above it, just to kind of have this, I guess, like a three-step experience of this whole series. So you have the physical plants, I had custom built these LCD screens that were the same aspect ratio as the tank. So you have this one-to-one experience of like the physical tank in the square, you have the video, and then you have this NFT, which you cannot see, but it's data. And it's a different experience for sure, seeing the video of it and seeing the real thing. I feel like it's a completely different work almost, and so it's almost hard to compare like which one. But with the video, it's interesting because you're able to share it so much easier to people. Like these tanks can't necessarily move to locations
Mhm.
once it's installed. Like once it's placed in the substrate, like it's not moving,
Yeah.
it's not going anywhere, and so it's much easier for me to share this work and like share the essence of what the physical piece is in video form. And so that's kind of why I really appreciate, or I've enjoyed working in this medium. And with also with video, you're able to create so many different experiences, just playing with scale and like making them like really, really large, and then it's becoming this immersive installation, or having them be like a small piece, or like there's so much range in that sense, where you can also control things, how the viewer experiences the work in your own way. But I would definitely do want to show people the real thing. I think it's a whole new experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's like, it's kind of like also the process of how you go about doing it, because obviously, like the tanks are such an integral part of
Right.
your creative process. So it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like a step, right? You have like the actual like going out in the wild and looking for these plants, then kind of applying, like putting them, taking out the
With,
chlorophyll,
like, my
which,
clippers and, like, a basket,
yeah.
my neighbors being like
I mean, like, I don't know if you've ever done a like, behind the scenes kind of like video or something, but that would be like just a film of its own, it's like
Yeah, yeah.
that's amazing. And do you have these just like, do you have these tanks like in your studio? So like you kind of like, okay, yeah.
I do. So my studio, like, honestly, a lot of people pass by it, and when I don't have any tanks on, people think it's like an aquarium or like a
Yeah.
like a fish store or something like that. Like, I actually did have someone walk in and be like, "Is this like a fish store?" And I'm like, "No, no, no. Like, it's not." I have like 8 humongous aquarium tanks just like lined up in my studio with all these like lights and, you know, yeah. So
Have you had I mean, it's like your I don't know if like I'm wrong or right in saying this, but like I've never seen, I've never come across somebody that has this kind of, creative process and does this type of thing. Like, do you know of others, or have you inspired others to like start working this way with plants and doing this kind of, yeah.
I mean, I guess like I'm inspired by, I guess I'll start by saying like, well, I'm inspired by, um, by like these like aquascaping communities, and so that's what really drew me into using like the aquarium tanks or creating these aquatic environments. Um, and definitely spent a long time just kind of like and practicing aquascaping myself too, just as like a side hobby. And it's I recommend everyone try. Um, but the I don't necessarily know anyone who is really using plants like this in creating like an art for artistic
Yeah.
purposes. Like, there's a lot of studies out there more in like the medical world of just, if you're transplanting certain this is gonna get like super like clinical sounding, but like transplanting certain organs to like a different patient or things like that, you're able to extract the cells from that, from like a heart, for example, like a pig heart or something like that. There's been studies where things are you extract the cells from other organic materials, transplant it into something else, and so you can inject it with like a different cell. And so it's what I'm doing right now with these plants is creating like a host. So it's an empty shell of what it used to be. So it's just the physical skeletal form without having any of its, the properties of what it used to be in their body anymore. And so in a lot of this research is definitely drawn more from that community and
Mhm.
taking, I guess, more of a scientific or analytical approach to altering the physical tissue of the plants to create a medium that I then repurpose for an artistic purpose. But
It's interesting, no, but it's really interesting. It's also interesting how, you mentioned like medium quite a lot of times, like the plants are, your medium that you're repurposing artistically, essentially. And I guess like, the flip side to it is like NFTs are also a medium that you like repurpose like
right,
artistically for to showcase like this other medium that you're repurposing. So it's kind of like a whole
it all just like
um
stacks on top of each other. It's just this
yeah.
super meta thing.
But it's interesting to see this as, your like the way that you're explaining it and like describing it as like a medium, right? Like, and you just kind of are building scientifically, analytically, like creatively, like on top of, the plants, on top of like the technological like advancement. I don't know, I was just like thinking about this whilst you were speaking, but it's really unique.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I do like looking at it as a medium rather than it being like always just the final, because I think there's, the more I continue this process and the more I experiment with different types of plants, the more challenges I'm faced with. Like certain plants like don't work as well as others, and that's just um, like constantly challenging me to figure out why, and to develop new methods for new types of for new works. And like I call this a medium really because I just see this as a whole new like landscape of
Hmm.
like physically a landscape, but also just a whole new range of things I can work with now to create different types of environments. And so like the physical plant itself, like yes, that is the result of this process, but like how I'm arranging it and how I'm creating different types of landscape, to me, is what the work is going to become, or when that's how I want to use this process. Um, and so, recently I have like releasing some works that are more this full bodied arrangements rather than just being these solo plants. And that is something that I had never really challenged before, of just taking like so many varieties and kind of creating my own arrangements with things that just don't necessarily make sense in the typical botanical garden world, but what makes sense to me, and how to, like, I guess, like translate the message of what I want people to feel while looking at the tanks, by using like so many various types of plants that then to me just become like paint swatches. Like they're just like textural swatches, like what works here compositionally. Like a lot of the times, people ask like, oh, like, do you arrange these like prior to actually doing the installations? But each plant is so delicate that once you start working with it, you don't really want to, you know, you don't really want to mess with it too much. Um, and a lot of it is just like on spot in installation wise, and they're kind of just like made as I go. So that was a completely new challenge in just taking. It's no longer just about the process. It's now just about what I'm doing with the process. So then looking at it
And
as a whole.
there's something about like there there's always, whenever I was looking at your work, there was like this feeling of that you can like it's texture. I don't know, it's like weird, but it's like it feels like as if it's like fluffy and like really delicate, which it's even like in the background that we have here, if you I mean, me personally, I'm gonna say like what I feel, but like I feel like it gives you a sense of like the texture of the plants. Like it reminds me almost, of like sometimes like jellyfish. I don't know, like
Yeah,
I have this like
sure.
kind of like comparison in my mind.
It's a
Like
similar
do
texture.
you do you like in terms of like actual like texture, like the way that it's showcased like in the work, do you like in any way kind of change it, or it's exactly like how it's seen from like the aquatic tanks?
In terms of what, like from the video to the physical and the
Yeah,
real.
yeah.
Um, you know, so all the video works are shot in color, and the main thing is like I definitely do take out some of like I take out like the lights, like what the tank itself is just to me the setup, and it's kind of like you're staging a whole background. You have like the backdrop and things like that. Um, for the tanks, what you see in the tanks and what you see in the video are pretty much exactly what you're gonna
The
get.
same.
They're really similar. The only thing that's adjusted is just like changing the kill like really the black background to make sure like the plants really do pop out. But oh yeah. And kind of
Yeah,
creating, kind of making it seem as though it's kind of encapsulated in this void of darkness. So the plants themselves are the thing that's illuminating the space.
think this is also the California poppy is the one that it's in the Mocha Genesis collection. It's just a movement,
Mm-hmm.
like it's so subtle, but it's
Mm-hmm.
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, the
It's
California
inter
poppy, that was the very first series that I had done successfully. And so it was a that was a very joyous time for like so many different reasons. But yeah, the California poppy was the very first one, and so I think and I started the NFT space with the poppy as well, with the solo California poppy, standing on one.
yeah. I'm just looking at yeah, it's and also like I can like the latest ones as you mentioned are going more like into, as you were saying, like composition, like it's like more, there's more going on, which is really like this is insane.
Thank you. This is actually one of the pieces that was in that show that I previously mentioned in my studio.
Wow, okay.
So this was a
And
physical
yeah,
tank that people came and saw in real life, and also saw like the digital, that one as well.
that's insane. And what is the reaction when people see these plants in the tank? Like, what is the what 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 are the comments, you know?
The first reaction is people just like whip out their phones. They're just like, yeah, it was, it was funny because like, for I really did get a firsthand experience in exactly that question because I was so curious too. A lot of this work I had done, privately in studio, but also it was during quarantine, so no one had seen these in real life, like at all, besides my family or like my really really close friends. And so the show was an opportunity for me to actually open up the space to the public to have people I don't know come by as like a totally open viewing of these works. And I was also there every single day of that show, of the duration of the show opening, because it was my space. And so um, yeah, it was so interesting for me to know what the reactions were of people when they first saw these. And I guess it really like boiled down to three questions that they would ask. It was always kind of like, A, like, are these real? Like, how long does it last? And I guess, yeah, like what made you do this? Like, this is so weird, kind of thing. Yeah,
What
yeah.
about
So I
like
guess that answers this question first. And yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely. But what about, I'm also interested to understand like how, what happens like with like I don't know if it's the right word, like when they kind of start disintegrating and like, there's a process that the flower, fades away, like it doesn't look
Mhm.
like this anymore. How does that
Yeah.
happen? And have you thought about maybe, I don't know, like documenting it or having like like something done on that side as well?
Right. Yeah. No. Oh no. It's fascinating. So this is actually something that I'm recently discovering as well, because I had never kept a full tank like that up for so long. And so a lot of these tanks that you see now, I actually kept up for about like 6 months or so past its initial installation to really see for myself just how these plants evolve and it change over time. Um, and what's really fascinating with this is that the plants, so like I was saying before, like when the plant is already transformed from the original to this kind of the ghostly shell of itself, when it's submerged underwater, it does have the ability to stand back up. And so out of water, it's really kind of this like life, like limp, kind of like a jellyfish, like you were saying. But then the minute you submerge it underwater, like that's what really brings the plants back to life. And so, I was calling this series Afterlife because it was also just kind of like my interpretation of like what it would, like what would it look like if it was if there was like a beyond, or just kind of thinking of life and death in this way and capturing what an extension of that life could look like in that liminal space between like these plants are no longer alive, but they're also moving in like this in the in this like ghostly way. But so yeah, so I was installing these tanks and they're perfectly upright, and it was like that for about a couple months or so. And then it was amazing because like I started to notice that these plants were actually starting to like rewilt. And so like the heads of the plants, like they're starting to slowly look down, like just like they do out in nature. And it's a different way of the decomposition of these plants are obviously very different than what it is outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
But the way they, really now surpass this afterlife that I've created, they part in a really similar like fashion in terms of how they disintegrate. And so it really just starts with like the top heads of the plants like starting to face down, and then that slowly just starts like flatten down, like and then parts of the leaves they start shedding just from the perimeter of the plant itself. And so you start to get like this like really fuzzy, it's kind of like a feathered feel. um, and that just slowly and slowly starts to shrink the whole insulation down into this white dust on the ground.
That's
And so,
incredible.
and
Like,
like that's a whole nother thing in itself, and it's part of the work. The disintegration to me is also part of the work. Like I don't necessarily plan on keeping these as permanent installations in formaldehyde or anything like that. Um, and like all organic matter, like I am, borrowing the lives of these plants, and I do definitely want to send them off into, into the ether, in an appropriate way without keeping them in that state for too long. Um, but yeah, so that was also like a really interesting discovery for me. And in terms of processing it, it would take a long time to capture every day for like half a year or so, but it's definitely doable.
it's almost like, you know, I was thinking like it could be something that um, kind of like changes as, as time goes by. There's like for example, like if you think about NFTs, like because there's a smart contract, like you can set it up with like time, as time constraints, like with like variables of time. And you could have
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
whole process kind of like see what happens from, this that we're seeing like in the background to essentially like as it decomposes. I mean, that's just like
Right,
my
right.
my thought, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to see that too.
Yeah, no, no, definitely. It's interesting for me to see it in person. Um, I guess it's just a question of like how well that all translates onto film. Like
Yeah.
you really want to see like a whole decayed tank for a very long time? Like I don't know. Um,
But there's also like something else that I think is very like, your kind of like creative practice like embeds a lot of different things. You have like the physical, you have the analog, you have the film, and then you have everything kind of put together into the digital work, which is then, kind of processed as an NFT and sold. Like how, um, it takes time basically for you to kind of
Right.
like go through all of this. Like, what do you think about within the context of like crypto art and within the context of like NFTs? Like, did you find your kind of process as well? Firstly, I mean, for sure, it's like very unique, and there's like nobody that is doing this at all in any way or form. But how like are you balancing that within like the context of this like ecosystem, which feels like it's very fast paced, like kind of constantly like putting out work and stuff like that. Like, yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's I think that's definitely something that um I try not to let it affect me so much, but of course, like the nature of this whole space is insanely fast paced, and it's a whole different world than what it was 344 days ago when I when Alessio first like messaged me at that time. It's completely new universe, and it has a different atmosphere around it. It has a different, worldly. I don't want to say like opinions. Like we've gotten so much talk of like what the space is, like what it could be, what it's supposed to be, like what kind of art sells, what doesn't sell, like all that stuff to me, I think is I don't really, I don't really care. I think my Twitter is very like I'm barely really on it. I'll be honest. Like it took me so long to respond to you. It's like I barely like am on that kind of stuff. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is slow and it's methodical and it takes a lot of time and took a lot of practice, and it's not just something I can like whip out in a week. If someone asked me, um, and it wouldn't even be like no all-nighters would even let me lead me to that. It's just part of the whole process. But but then again, like I think that um regardless of all of how fast everything's moving for me, it's just I just follow like what makes sense with
Yeah.
with the results, and like with what works for me. And at the same time, I'm insanely appreciative of the space and the fact that we had developed a new platform that is allowing digital artists to really kind of like push themselves, and also be self-sustaining as artists. And a lot of the initial sales of these works, like to me, like it was unbelievable. Like I'm every single sale to me is like a new milestone. I'm just like, this is amazing. Like I'm so grateful. And it also allows me to kind of continue to make new works. Like a lot of this stuff is obviously I have the physical component of like the chemicals, of the lab, of the setup, of everything, and so it's this constant maintenance. And I really all that's really possible just through this new ecosystem. Um, and so I'm just grateful that there are people that have definitely taken an interest in this very strange new world that that I've created with the plants, and also with everyone's interest in NFTs, kind of creating like a really, you know, a a new space that I think for artists, like we should just always look at it from like a healthy perspective,
Hmm.
like without like too much noise or too much. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
whole
yeah, no, for sure.
like
And to be honest, I really love what you said about kind of your you focus on you, like your slow work that is bringing you what you want. At the end of the day, like you're doing what makes you happy, which is creating in whatever form, shape, sound, time it takes, which I think is a really healthy and, good way to approach it. Like whatever that means. Like at the end of the day, this is a medium, so it should be used as such, whatever that means for, each
Yeah.
creative individual.
Yeah, and speaking on just that, I mean, I've had my own opinions about this for a while, and obviously, talking amongst friends that are also involved in this space, like there's just so much, um, like I feel like there's never really a need to tell the world. I mean, I'm telling you now, but just in general, like on Twitter, like, oh, I haven't posted something in 2 months, guys, but just
Hmm.
wait, like next week, or like, or like that whole, I think that comes from a place of definitely feeling the pressure and needing to explain yourself or needing to explain your pace or your process, which I think is just such an unnecessary thing to do, especially if you're making work because hopefully you enjoy it first, right? Like
Yeah, of course.
I feel like a lot of that just kind of gets lost, or maybe it's just lost in translation with like a one-liner Twitter thing. But a lot of the times, I think like for anyone that's like starting this space now, like I wonder what they think. Just like, oh, everyone's pumping out so much stuff so fast. Like I gotta have this big presence online. Like I have to do all these things. And I think those are like superficial barriers are exactly why NFTs can be judged in such a critical way. Um, but to me, and like I think it's also just stemming from like a more traditional sense of if you're sculpting something, like it takes as long as it takes. You don't need to justify that.
Yeah.
You don't need to talk about it. It's just when you're done, you're done. And then that's when, that's when you can start to talk to people about it. It's like,
I agree 100%. I think it's incredible that you're saying that. And I think, um, like if people that are coming into the space and are listening to this, it's so powerful what you're saying because it's true. Um, you don't always have to be pumping out work or, doing something every day. Like it takes as long as it takes, as long as it makes you happy. I sometimes like whenever this is a bit like derailing, but like whenever somebody maybe asks me like, what should I do this or should I do that? It's like, well, you should do whatever you want to. Like that's the whole point of NFTs, right? It's like giving you the independence. If not, you're just kind of working for clients. Like if the way that you approach the work is becoming more of like I should do this because of,
right,
then
right.
it's a different dynamic, right? So it's yeah, I mean that the whole point of this was to give artists the independence and creative freedom that they wanted. If you want to do a work every day, do it. If you don't. That it should be something that it's just about what you are and how you create.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want to do it, just do it. Like you don't need to talk about it. Jeez.
I love it, Luna. Well, it was amazing to hear about your work. Like I was, when I was thinking about this interview, I thought, okay, this is gonna be amazing. But this was like a whole other level. Like it's insane to know about what goes behind the work. Really, really interesting. So thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
sharing.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. This was fun.
Thanks a lot. It was great.
All right. See ya.
See
Thanks.
ya. Bye bye.